A vampire king found his granddaughter living in a shelter. Where is your $2 million trust fund? Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The rain fell steadily over the quiet streets of Baltimore late that night. Water slid down broken streetlights and collected in shallow puddles along the sidewalk outside a small youth shelter that most people passed without ever noticing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of laundry soap and warm soup. A few teenagers sat at old wooden tables, finishing a late dinner, while others rested in worn chairs near the wall. For them, this place was not a home. It was simply somewhere safe to sleep for a while. At the far end of the room, a thin girl with long brown hair slept in a plastic chair with a faded backpack resting against her feet. Her name was Lily Harper. She was 17 years old and had been living in shelters and temporary homes for almost 2 years. Most people who saw her would never guess that anything about her life had once been different. Her clothes were simple and slightly worn. Her shoes had small cracks along the soles. Yet when the overhead light shifted and touched her face, there was something unusual about her eyes. Even while she slept, they carried a strange golden shade that seemed to glow faintly in the dim room. Outside the shelter, a long black car rolled slowly to a stop beside the curb. The vehicle looked completely out of place on that quiet street. Its surface reflected the rain like dark glass, and its engine made almost no sound at all. The back door opened, and a tall man stepped out into the storm without hesitation. He wore a long black coat that moved with the wind like a shadow. His name was Alexander Voss. For more than 600 years, he had ruled one of the oldest vampire bloodlines in the world. His empire stretched across continents through banks, corporations, and ancient alliances hidden from human eyes. Powerful leaders feared him. Wealthy families respected him. Yet tonight, the ancient king was not standing in a palace or a boardroom. He was walking toward a shelter that most of the city had forgotten. The staff inside barely had time to react before the tall stranger entered. Conversation stopped immediately. Something about his presence changed the air in the room. Even those who did not understand why suddenly felt the urge to step back. Alexander Voss removed his gloves slowly as his eyes moved across the room, searching with calm precision. He passed the tables. He passed the quiet hallway. Then he stopped beside the sleeping girl in the plastic chair. For a long moment, the ancient king did not speak. He simply looked down at her face, as if trying to confirm something impossible. When Lily slowly opened her eyes, the golden color within them caught the light. The effect was immediate. Alexander Voss froze completely, because in that instant he recognized the unmistakable mark of his own bloodline. The blood of the Voss family had not vanished after all. It had been here the entire time, sleeping in a shelter while the world believed she had nothing. And when the ancient king finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with a power that made the entire room fall silent. He looked at the confused girl and asked a question that would soon shake far more than this small shelter. Where is your $2 million trust fund? Alexander Voss did not raise his voice after asking the question. He simply stood there beside the plastic chair while the rain tapped softly against the shelter windows. The entire room had gone quiet. Even the teenagers who had been talking only moments earlier now watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Lily Harper blinked slowly as if she had not heard the words correctly. Her mind was still foggy from sleep, and the strange tension in the room made her chest tighten with confusion. She sat up a little straighter in the chair and brushed a strand of brown hair away from her face. I do not know what you are talking about, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but tired in the way only someone who had spent too many nights without a real home could sound. Alexander Voss studied her face carefully. The golden color in her eyes was unmistakable. That shade did not appear by accident. It belonged to the ancient bloodline that had ruled the northern vampire courts for centuries. Yet the girl in front of him wore a second-hand jacket and shoes that had clearly walked many miles. Nothing about her life matched the truth of what she was. The shelter manager, Grace Miller, stepped closer with cautious politeness. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a tired expression that came from years of working long nights, helping young people who had nowhere else to go. So she said carefully, "This is a youth shelter. If you're looking for someone, I would be happy to help, but these young people have already had a difficult day." Alexander turned his gaze toward her. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Grace pause mid-sentence. "I'm looking for Lily Harper," he replied. Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, that is her. She arrived here a little over 2 years ago through the city placement program. She has been one of our most responsible residents ever since." Lily lowered her eyes slightly as the adults spoke about her, as if she were not sitting right there. She had grown used to that feeling. Caseworkers, teachers, social workers. People had talked about her life for years now, but no one had ever mentioned anything about a trust fund. She looked back up at the tall stranger standing beside her chair. "I think you have the wrong person," she said. "I do not have any money like that. I never have." Alexander listened carefully to every word she spoke. There was no deception in her voice, only honest confusion. That realization made the ancient king very still. For a moment, the memories of the past began to move through his mind like distant thunder. 20 years earlier, his son Jonathan Voss had disappeared from the family estate with his wife and their newborn daughter. At the time, the disappearance had been treated as a tragedy. The official records claimed the young family had died in a terrible accident during a winter storm in the mountains of Colorado. Their car had never been found. Their bodies had never been recovered. For years, Alexander Voss had accepted that explanation, even though something about it had always felt incomplete. Now the truth stood quietly in front of him, wearing worn shoes and a borrowed jacket. Lily Harper watched the stranger carefully. Something about him made the air feel colder. Not frightening exactly, just powerful in a way she could not explain. She shifted slightly in the chair and wrapped her arms around herself. "Look," she said softly, "I appreciate the concern, but I think there has been a mistake. My parents died when I was very young. I grew up in foster homes after that. No one ever mentioned any family with money." Grace nodded gently. "That part is true," she added. "Lily has been through the foster system since she was a small child. Her records say both parents died in an accident when she was a baby." Alexander slowly removed a small silver ring from his hand. The ring carried the ancient crest of the Voss bloodline, a crown surrounded by a single drop-shaped ruby. As he held it between his fingers, the faint light in the room touched the metal, and the ruby seemed to glow softly. He knelt slightly so that he was now looking directly at Lily at eye level. His voice remained calm, but carried the quiet weight of 6 centuries. "Lily Harper," he said, "there has been no mistake. The trust fund was created the day you were born. $2 million placed in your name to ensure that you would never experience the life you're living now." Lily stared at him in disbelief. $2 million, she repeated slowly. The number sounded unreal coming out her mouth. She shook her head. "That cannot be real. I would know if something like that existed." Alexander Voss closed his hand gently around the ring. "That is exactly what concerns me," he said quietly, "because if you did not receive it, then someone else did." The shelter remained quiet after Alexander Voss spoke those final words. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. Lily Harper sat frozen in the plastic chair as the meaning of what he had said slowly settled into her mind. Someone else did receive it. The sentence echoed inside her thoughts like a distant bell. She had spent most of her life believing that she simply had nothing. No family, no money, no inheritance, just a long chain of temporary homes and borrowed rooms. The idea that $2 million had once existed in her name felt impossible. Grace Miller folded her arms thoughtfully as she studied the tall stranger kneeling beside Lily. "Sir," she said carefully, "I have worked with many young people who have complicated family histories, but accusations about missing money are very serious. If you're saying that someone stole funds meant for this girl, then that would involve legal authorities." Alexander Voss slowly stood again. His height made the room feel smaller. "I'm aware of that," he replied calmly. and I assure you the truth will be uncovered. Lily looked between the two adults with growing uncertainty. Wait, she said softly. Why do you even think that money belonged to me in the first place? You talk like you knew my parents, but I do not even know who you are. Alexander Voss turned toward her fully now. The overhead light reflected faintly in his pale eyes, and for a moment the centuries behind those eyes seemed almost visible. You deserve an answer, he said. 20 years ago, my son Jonathan Voss and his wife Emily disappeared during a winter storm in the mountains of Colorado. They were traveling with their infant daughter. Lily felt something tighten in her chest. Her records had always said her parents died in an accident when she was very young, but no one had ever spoken their names to her before. Jonathan and Emily, she repeated slowly as if testing the sound of them. Alexander nodded once. They were declared dead after the authorities could not find a vehicle. The mountains were dangerous that winter. The official investigation ended after several months. Lily shook her head, slightly trying to process what she was hearing. And what does that have to do with me, she asked. Alexander stepped closer. Everything, he answered quietly, because that infant daughter was you. The words seemed to freeze the air around them. Lily stared at him in disbelief. That is not possible, she said immediately. My records say my parents were just ordinary people. They never said anything about a family like yours. Grace Miller looked equally stunned. Mr. Voss, if what you're saying is true, then this changes everything about Lily's situation. Alexander folded his hands behind his back. For centuries, the Voss family had protected its history carefully. But tonight, there was no reason to hide the truth. My family has controlled one of the oldest private financial empires in the world, he explained calmly. When you were born, I established a trust fund in your name to ensure your future safety. $2 million placed under legal protection until you reach adulthood. Lily stared at the floor as she tried to imagine such an amount. She had spent nights worrying about how to afford a bus pass or a pair of new shoes. The numbers sounded unreal. If that money existed then, where did it go, she whispered. Alexander Voss turned his gaze toward the rain-streaked window as memories continued to surface in his mind. After the accident, the legal management of the trust fund was transferred to the family attorney who had handled our estate matters for many years. His name was Victor Hale. Grace Miller frowned slightly. That name sounded familiar to her, though she could not immediately place it. Alexander continued, speaking in a voice that remained calm, but carried a growing weight beneath it. For 2 decades, Victor Hale reported that the funds were secure and untouched. According to his records, you were living under state guardianship until adulthood. Yet tonight, I find you sleeping in a youth shelter with no knowledge of the fortune meant to protect you. Lily slowly lifted her eyes again. The quiet certainty in Alexander's voice made her heart begin to race. Are you saying someone lied about my entire life, she asked. Alexander Voss looked directly at her, and his answer came without hesitation. Yes, he said quietly, and I intend to discover exactly who did it. The rain outside the shelter grew heavier as the night moved forward. Water streamed down the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere over the city of Baltimore. Inside the building, the quiet tension had not faded. Lily Harper still sat in the plastic chair, trying to process everything she had just heard. Her mind struggled to accept the possibility that her entire life story might be wrong. Across from her, Alexander Voss stood completely still, his expression calm yet focused. For centuries, he had learned to read the smallest details in a room. Heartbeats, breathing patterns, unspoken fear. Right now, he could sense Lily's confusion and disbelief clearly. She was not pretending. She truly had no knowledge of the inheritance that should have protected her life. That realization strengthened his suspicion that something had gone terribly wrong years ago. Grace Miller finally broke the silence. Mr. Voss, she said carefully, if what you are saying is true, then we need documentation. You cannot simply appear in a youth shelter and claim a family connection without proof. Lily deserves clarity before anything else happens tonight. Alexander Voss nodded once in quiet agreement. You are correct, he replied. Evidence is necessary. Without another word, he reached inside the pocket of his long black coat and removed a thin leather wallet. From it, he carefully pulled a small folded document sealed inside a transparent protective sleeve. The paper was old but preserved with extreme care. He held it out so Grace could see the name printed across the top. Lily Harper Voss Trust Account. Established on the day of her birth. Grace leaned closer to read the details. Her eyes widened slowly as she saw the official bank seal and the legal authorization signatures attached to the document. This appears legitimate, she admitted quietly. Lily watched the exchange with growing tension. Her hands rested tightly in her lap. That paper has my name, she said softly. But that does not explain how you found me tonight. Alexander turned toward her again. For many years he had believed the records provided by Victor Hale. According to those documents, Lily had been living safely under supervised guardianship programs arranged through private institutions. The truth had remained hidden because the reports always appeared normal. But several nights earlier, something unexpected had changed everything. One of Alexander's security advisors had discovered a discrepancy while reviewing long-neglected family estate records. A routine financial audit had revealed that the trust account established in Lily's name no longer existed in the bank system. The funds had disappeared almost 10 years earlier. At first, Alexander believed it was a simple accounting error. But when investigators attempted to track the transaction history, they discovered that the entire record chain had been quietly redirected through several private legal channels controlled by Victor Hale. That discovery forced Alexander to begin a deeper investigation. His team followed the financial trail through multiple banks across 3 states. Each step revealed more irregularities. The money had been transferred and divided through complicated legal structures designed to hide its origin. Eventually, the investigation reached a final clue hidden in an old guardianship record filed with the Maryland Department of Social Services. That record contained a single name: Lily Harper, temporary foster placement, Baltimore Youth Assistance Program. When Alexander heard that information, he left his estate immediately. Tonight was the first moment he had finally seen her with his own eyes. Lily listened carefully as the story unfolded. The idea that someone had secretly moved her inheritance through banks and legal offices sounded like something from a crime investigation television show. Yet the calm certainty in Alexander's voice made it impossible to dismiss. Grace Miller crossed her arms thoughtfully. If this attorney Victor Hale had control of the trust account, then he would also have access to Lily legal records, she said slowly. That means he could influence where she was placed after her parents died. Alexander Voss looked toward the window again. The rain continued falling steadily outside. Exactly, he said quietly, which raises a very serious question. If Victor Hale controlled both the money and the records, then he also controlled Lily's entire childhood. Lily felt a chill run through her spine. She had spent years believing the foster system simply moved her from place to place because that was how life worked for children without families. But now a new possibility stood in front of her. What if her life had been guided by someone else's decisions all along? Alexander Voss finally turned back toward her with a calm but unbreakable resolve in his voice. "We will find the truth, Lily," he said quietly, "and when we do, the person responsible will answer for every single year you lost." For a long moment after Alexander Voss finished speaking, the shelter felt strangely quiet. The rain continued tapping against the windows while the fluorescent lights hummed softly above the room. Lily Harper sat very still with her hands folded together in her lap. Everything she believed about her life had started to feel uncertain. Across from her, Alexander Voss stood with calm patience, but inside his ancient mind, another realization was forming. The faint golden color in Lily's eyes had already confirmed the bloodline connection, but there was something deeper he needed to verify. Slowly, he reached once again into the pocket of his coat and removed the silver ring bearing the crest of the Voss family. The metal surface reflected the overhead light as he held it between 2 fingers. Lily watched the ring carefully. It looked old and valuable, but she could not understand why it seemed so important to him. Was it, she asked quietly. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped a little closer and lowered the ring, so the ruby at its center caught the light directly in front of her. "This ring carries the blood seal of my family," he explained calmly. It has been worn by every head of the Voss bloodline for more than 500 years. Lily shifted slightly in her chair. I still do not understand what that has to do with me, she said. Alexander Voss knelt slightly so that the ring was closer to her hand. The answer will reveal itself, he said quietly. Grace Miller watched with cautious curiosity from a few feet away. She was not certain what kind of test the stranger intended, but something about the moment felt strangely serious. Lily hesitated but finally lifted her hand slowly. The moment her fingertips brushed the silver surface of the ring, something unexpected happened. The ruby stone at the center suddenly glowed with a faint golden light. It was not bright enough to illuminate the entire room, but it was clearly visible to everyone standing nearby. Lily pulled her hand back immediately in shock. Did you see that? She whispered. Grace stepped forward with wide eyes. Yes, she said softly. The stone just lit up. Alexander Voss closed his eyes briefly, as if confirming something he had suspected all along. The ancient seal never reacts to anyone outside the bloodline, he said calmly. It recognizes only those who carry the direct heritage of the Voss family. Lily stared at the ring in disbelief. Are you saying that proves what you told me earlier? She asked. That I am really your granddaughter. Alexander opened his eyes again and looked directly at her. Yes, Lily, he said. There is no doubt now. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that night. Lily leaned back slowly in the plastic chair as the truth settled into her thoughts. For 17 years, she had believed she was simply another child lost in the foster system. Yet the glowing ring had just confirmed that her life was connected to something far older and far larger than she had ever imagined. Grace Miller placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. This is a lot to process, she said kindly. You do not need to understand everything tonight. But Lily's attention remained fixed on Alexander Voss. If all of this is true, she said quietly, then why did no one come looking for me before now? Alexander's face showed a brief shadow of regret. Because I believe the reports given to me, he answered. For many years, Victor Hale assured me that you were safe under private guardianship and receiving proper care. The records I saw showed school, enrollment, medical coverage, and housing arrangements. Lily shook her head slowly. None of that happened, she said. I moved through 7 different foster homes before I turned 15, and after that I ended up here. Alexander Voss' expression hardened slightly as he listened. Every detail she described confirmed the growing suspicion inside his mind. Someone had not only stolen the trust fund, but had also rewritten the official records to hide the truth. He stood upright again and placed the ring back onto his finger. The rain outside continued falling as thunder rolled softly over the distant skyline. This deception ends now, he said in a quiet but unbreakable voice. Lily looked up at him uncertainly. What happens next? She asked. Alexander Voss answered without hesitation. Next we confront the man who controlled your life for the past 17 years. And we ask him exactly what he did with your inheritance. The shelter slowly returned to quiet conversation after the strange glow of the silver ring faded, but the atmosphere in the room had already changed. Several of the teenagers nearby continued to glance curiously toward Lily and the tall stranger standing beside her. They did not understand what had just happened, but they could feel that something important had taken place. Lily Harper remained seated with her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. A few minutes earlier, she believed she was simply another teenager trying to survive until adulthood. Now she had been told she belonged to a powerful family, that a fortune had once existed in her name, and that someone might have controlled her entire childhood from the shadows. Across from her, Alexander Voss stood near the window, looking out at the rain falling over the dark streets of Baltimore. His posture remained calm and composed, but inside his mind calculations were already forming. For centuries, he had governed vampire courts and financial empires that stretched across continents. Deception was not unfamiliar to him. What troubled him tonight was the scale of the betrayal. If Victor Hale had manipulated both financial records and guardianship documents, then the situation was far more serious than simple theft. Grace Miller approached slowly with a folder in her hands. I believe you should see this, she said gently. She handed the folder to Alexander. These are Lily placement records from the last 2 years. We keep copies for safety in case any questions arise about residency or support programs. Alexander accepted the folder and began reading the documents with careful attention. Each page listed small details about Lily life. Temporary housing approvals, school transfer confirmations, health evaluations required by the state. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Yet as Alexander examined the signatures at the bottom of each document, his eyes narrowed slightly. Every authorization had been issued through the same private legal office that once managed the Voss family estate. Victor Hale and Associates. Lily watched him read in silence. "What do those papers say?" she asked finally. Alexander closed the folder slowly. "They confirm what I suspected," he replied. "The same legal authority that controlled your trust fund also approved every major decision about your placement in the foster system." Grace frowned as she processed that information. "Are you saying that this attorney had direct influence over where Lily lived all these years?" she asked. Alexander nodded once. "That is exactly what the records suggest." Lily felt a slow wave of realization pass through her chest. The foster homes, the sudden transfers, the schools that changed almost every year. For so long, she believed it was simply bad luck. But now a darker possibility appeared. Someone may have been quietly guiding those decisions from the beginning. "Why would anyone do that?" she asked softly. Alexander Voss looked toward her with calm seriousness. "Because a child without stability is easier to keep invisible," he said. "If no one looks closely, then no one asks questions." Grace Miller crossed her arms thoughtfully. "That means whoever controlled those records wanted Lily to remain unnoticed," she said. "Exactly," Alexander replied. "If the truth about her inheritance ever surfaced, then the missing funds would immediately be investigated." The rain outside began to lighten as the storm slowly passed across the city skyline. Alexander placed the folder carefully on the table. For a moment, he remained silent while his thoughts reached further beyond the shelter walls. In other parts of the country, powerful vampire families maintained their own hidden networks of information. If news spread that the heir of the Voss bloodline had been living in poverty, it would create shock throughout those circles. Lily noticed the tension in his expression. "Is something else wrong?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked back at her. "Yes," he answered. "The moment this situation becomes known, many powerful people will start asking questions. And not all of them will ask out of kindness." Lily felt a small chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked. Alexander Voss' voice lowered slightly as he spoke the next words. "The Voss family has enemies, Lily. Old enemies who would be very interested to learn that the last heir of our bloodline spent years unprotected in the human world." For several seconds after Alexander Voss spoke those final words, the room felt colder than before. Lily Harper remained seated while the weight of his warning slowly settled into her thoughts. Enemies. She had spent her entire life worrying about ordinary problems like school assignments, bus schedules, and finding part-time work. The idea that powerful enemies might exist somewhere beyond the shelter walls sounded unreal. Yet the calm seriousness in Alexander's voice made it impossible to dismiss. Grace Miller glanced toward the windows where the rain had begun to slow. Most of the other teenagers had quietly returned to their conversations, but a few still watched Lily with curiosity. "Mr. Voss," she said carefully, "if there are people who might harm Lily, then we should consider her safety immediately." Alexander nodded slowly. "I agree. That is one of the reasons I came here personally tonight." Lily looked up at him with uncertainty. "Why would anyone want to hurt me?" she asked. "I have never done anything to anyone." Alexander stepped closer and rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair beside her. "Because you carry the Voss bloodline," he explained quietly. "In a hidden world where my family exists, power and legacy are taken very seriously. Some families would see your existence as a threat." Lily struggled to understand what he meant. "But I'm just a normal person," she said. "I do not even know anything about that world." Alexander gave a faint, thoughtful expression. "That may be true today," he replied. "But the moment the truth about your identity becomes known, things will change quickly." Grace folded her arms. "Then we should keep this information private until you understand exactly what happened with the trust fund," she suggested. Alexander considered her words carefully. That would be wise. However, secrecy alone will not solve the deeper problem. Lily leaned forward slightly. You mean Victor Hale, she said quietly. Yes, Alexander answered. The man who controlled both your inheritance and your legal records for 17 years. Lily felt a quiet frustration building inside her chest. For years, she had blamed circumstances for the hardships she experienced. Now it seemed possible that one person might have quietly shaped those circumstances from the beginning. I want to know why he did it, she said firmly. Alexander looked at her with calm approval. And you deserve that answer, he replied. But before we confront him, there is something else you must understand. Lily waited silently as he continued speaking. The Voss family does not operate like ordinary families, he explained. Our history extends back many centuries, and our influence reaches into places most humans never see. When someone harms a member of our bloodline, the consequences are taken very seriously. Grace raised an eyebrow slightly at the calm certainty in his tone. You speak as if justice is already guaranteed, she said. Alexander Voss looked toward the shelter door where the street lights outside reflected on the wet pavement. Justice is never guaranteed, he answered quietly. But I have spent 600 years ensuring that betrayal never goes unanswered. Lily studied his expression carefully. For the first time, she began to understand that the stranger standing beside her was not simply a wealthy businessman. There was something older and far more powerful behind his calm voice. The thought was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. After a moment, she asked the question that had been growing in her mind since he arrived. If Victor Hale stole the money and controlled my records, then why would he let me live at all? Would it not have been easier to make sure I disappeared completely? Alexander Voss paused before answering. His eyes grew slightly darker as he considered the possibility. That is an excellent question, Lily, he said quietly. And the answer may reveal something even more dangerous than stolen money. Lily felt the tension in the room grow again. What do you mean, she asked. Alexander Voss turned his gaze back toward her and spoke with calm certainty. I believe Victor Hale did not expect you to survive this long. The words spoken by Alexander Voss lingered in the quiet shelter long after he finished the sentence. Lily Harper stared at him as a slow wave of unease moved through her chest. I believe Victor Hale did not expect you to survive this long. The idea sounded cold and impossible at the same time. For several seconds, Lily said nothing. She simply tried to understand how anyone could make such a decision about another human life. Grace Miller also looked disturbed by the implication. That is a serious claim, she said carefully. Are you suggesting that the system placements were intentionally arranged to put Lily in difficult situations? Alexander Voss nodded slightly. It is possible, he replied. If a child grows up without stability, without resources, and without anyone protecting them, then the world often does the rest. Lily lowered her gaze to the floor. She remembered the home she had lived in before arriving at the Baltimore shelter. Some had been kind but temporary. Others had been chaotic and unpredictable. There had been months when she felt invisible to everyone around her. At the time, she believed those experiences were simply part of growing up in the foster system. Now, she wondered if someone had quietly allowed those circumstances to happen. Why would he do that, she asked softly. If he already had the money, then why keep controlling my life after that? Alexander stepped closer to the table where the folder of documents rested. Because the trust fund was not the only thing connected to you, he explained calmly. Lily looked up again. What else could there be, she asked. Alexander paused for a moment before answering. The Voss family wealth extends far beyond money placed in a bank account. Land holdings, investment networks, and private ownership agreements that have existed for centuries are connected to our bloodline. If the last living heir of the family disappears, then control of those structures eventually shifts to the legal authority managing the estate. Grace Miller slowly understood the meaning behind those words. Are you saying this attorney could eventually gain control of your family assets if Lily were no longer alive, she asked. Alexander did not immediately respond, but the silence itself was enough to confirm the possibility. Lily felt the room spin slightly as she absorbed the implications. That means he might have been waiting for something to happen to me, she said quietly. Perhaps not directly, Alexander replied, but he would certainly benefit if you were no longer present to claim your inheritance when you reached adulthood. Grace shook her head in disbelief. That is an enormous risk to take just to gain financial power, she said. Alexander folded his hands behind his back as he looked toward the shelter door. Some people are willing to gamble everything when enough money and influence are involved, he replied. Lily leaned back slowly in the chair, trying to steady her breathing. For years, she had struggled to imagine what her future might look like after leaving the shelter system. She had planned to work part-time, save what little money she could, and maybe attend community college if she was lucky. Now she was learning that her entire life might have been shaped by a hidden conflict involving wealth and power she never knew existed. After a long moment, she looked back at Alexander with determination growing in her voice. Then we cannot wait any longer, she said. If Victor Hale did all of this, then he needs to explain it immediately. Alexander studied her expression with quiet approval. Courage in the face of uncertainty was a trait that had defined the Voss bloodline for generations. I agree, he said. The truth must be confronted directly. Grace glanced between them both. What exactly are you planning to do, she asked. Alexander Voss reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a small phone. The screen glowed softly as he opened a contact list that contained only a few carefully selected names. We're going to invite Victor Hale to a conversation, he said calmly. And once he arrives, we will ask him to explain exactly where Lily's inheritance went and why her life was hidden from the world. Alexander Voss held the phone in his hand for several seconds without dialing. The dim light from the screen reflected faintly across his face while the quiet shelter continued its late-night routine. Around them, Lily Harper watched him closely. Everything that had happened during the last hour still felt unreal to her. Only a short time earlier, she had been planning how to finish her homework before the lights-out rule at the shelter. Now she was standing beside a man who claimed to be her grandfather and who was preparing to confront the attorney who might have controlled her life for 17 years. Grace Miller remained near the table with her arms crossed in concern. Mr. Voss, she said carefully, before you make that call, there is something we should consider. If this man truly manipulated financial records and legal placements, then he is not likely to admit it easily. Alexander looked up from the phone and nodded slightly. You are correct, he replied. Victor Hale is not careless. For 2 decades, he maintained the illusion that everything surrounding Lily guardianship was normal. That level of deception requires planning. Lily felt her chest tighten again as the reality of the situation settled further into her thoughts. Then how do we make him tell the truth, she asked. Alexander slipped the phone back into his coat pocket for a moment and walked slowly toward the shelter window. The rain had almost stopped now, and the city lights reflected across the wet pavement outside. Sometimes the truth appears when a person believes they are still in control of the situation, he said quietly. Grace frowned slightly. What exactly does that mean, she asked. Alexander turned back toward them with calm certainty in his expression. It means Victor Hale must not realize that Lily has already been found, he explained. If he believes the inheritance question remains buried, then he will arrive confident and unprepared. Lily considered that idea carefully. You want him to walk into a conversation thinking everything is still under his control, she said. Exactly, Alexander replied. That is when people make mistakes. Grace nodded slowly. That strategy makes sense, she admitted. But if you plan to meet him tonight, you will need a location that feels normal to him. Not a shelter where he might immediately become suspicious. Alexander walked back toward the table and opened the folder of documents once more. According to these records, Victor Hale operates his legal office downtown, less than 15 minutes from here, he said. His schedule shows evening appointments twice a week for private clients. Lily looked toward him with cautious curiosity. Are you planning to go there, she asked. Alexander closed the folder and placed it carefully on the table. No, he answered. I'm going to invite him somewhere he cannot refuse. Grace raised an eyebrow slightly. And where would that be, she asked. Alexander Voss allowed a faint smile to appear for the first time since arriving at the shelter. Victor Hale has spent 20 years believing he manages the Voss family estate, he said. If he receives a message from me requesting a confidential meeting about new financial arrangements, he will come immediately. Lily felt another wave of tension run through her thoughts. What happens when he sees me there, she asked. Alexander met her eyes calmly. That moment will reveal the truth faster than any question I could ask, he said. Grace Miller glanced between them both. I assume you intend for Lily to be present during this meeting, she said. Alexander nodded once. This situation concerns her life directly. She deserves to hear every word Victor Hale says. Lily took a slow breath as she considered the idea. Part of her felt nervous about facing the man who might have shaped so many years of her life without her knowledge. Yet another part of her felt determined to finally understand why it happened. When do we do this? She asked quietly. Alexander Voss reached once more for the phone inside his coat and began typing a short message. Tonight, he replied, because after 17 years of silence, it is time for Victor Hale to explain exactly what he did with Lily Harper inheritance. Less than 1 hour later, the rain had completely stopped, and the streets of Baltimore reflected the pale glow of midnight streetlights. Alexander Voss stood beside a quiet black car parked across from an elegant glass office building in the financial district. The building belonged to Hale and Associates Legal Services. The name of the firm appeared in polished silver letters near the entrance. Lily Harper stood beside him on the sidewalk with her hands in the pockets of the borrowed jacket she had worn from the shelter. The night air felt cooler now, and the city seemed quieter than usual. Grace Miller had returned to the shelter after insisting Lily call her the moment everything was finished. Lily understood that Grace was worried about her safety, but she also knew this confrontation had to happen. Alexander had explained that the message sent to Victor Hale had been very simple. A confidential request from Alexander Voss regarding an urgent estate matter. According to the reply that arrived only minutes later, the attorney had agreed to meet immediately. Lily looked up at the tall building and felt a strange, nervous energy moving through her chest. So he thinks this meeting is about money, she said quietly. Yes, Alexander replied calmly. At this moment, he believes he is meeting a wealthy client to discuss future control of the Voss estate. Lily watched the entrance doors carefully. And when he realizes I am here, she asked. Alexander's voice remained steady. That is when the truth will reveal itself. Only a few minutes passed before the glass doors opened and a man in a dark business coat stepped outside. Victor Hale was in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and a confident expression that came from many years of working with powerful clients. He walked toward them with the relaxed posture of someone who believed he understood every situation before it began. Mr. Voss, he said with polite enthusiasm as he approached. I was surprised to receive your message so late in the evening, but I am always happy to discuss the family estate. Alexander Voss gave a calm nod in return. Thank you for coming on such short notice, he said. Victor Hale smiled slightly and adjusted the cuff of his coat. Of course, he replied. Managing the Voss legal structure has been one of the most important responsibilities of my career. Lily watched him carefully as he spoke. For years, this man had signed documents that shaped her life, yet she had never seen his face before tonight. Victor Hale finally noticed her standing beside Alexander. His eyes moved toward her with casual curiosity. And who might this be, he asked politely. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped slightly aside, so Lily stood clearly in the light from the building entrance. Victor Hale's gaze returned to her face, and for a brief moment, the confident smile on his lips disappeared completely. Lily saw the change instantly. The man who had looked so comfortable only seconds earlier suddenly seemed frozen. His eyes widened slightly as recognition passed across his expression. Good evening, Mr. Hale, Alexander said calmly. I would like to introduce you to Lily Harper, the last living heir of the Voss bloodline. The silence that followed felt heavier than the entire night before it. Victor Hale stared at Lily as if he had just seen a ghost standing under the streetlight. That is impossible, he said quietly. Alexander folded his hands behind his back. Is it, he replied calmly. Because according to the records you provided, for 17 years Lily Harper did not exist. Victor Hale looked between them with growing unease. That is not what I meant, he said quickly. I was told the child died in the accident with her parents. Lily took a step forward before she even realized she had moved. You told people I died, she asked softly. Victor Hale's face had already begun to pale. Alexander Voss' voice became colder than before as he spoke again. That is exactly what we are here to discuss, he said. Because the child you believed was gone has been living in a shelter while her $2 million inheritance disappeared. Victor Hale stood frozen beneath the streetlight outside his office building while the weight of Alexander Voss' words settled heavily in the night air. The confident expression he had carried only minutes earlier was now gone completely. His eyes moved from Alexander to Lily and back again, as if he hoped the scene would somehow change if he looked long enough. That cannot be true, he said again, quietly. The official report confirmed the accident killed the entire family. I personally handled the legal closure of the case. Alexander Voss took a slow step forward, and the calm authority in his presence made the sidewalk feel suddenly smaller. The report you referenced came from your own office, he replied. A document you prepared and submitted to the state court. Victor Hale swallowed slightly. His mind was clearly racing for an explanation that would restore the control he believed he still possessed. The accident records came from the local authorities, he insisted. I simply followed the legal procedures required after the investigation ended. Lily Harper stood a few feet away, watching the exchange carefully. For the first time, she noticed the small tremor in the attorney's voice. Earlier, he had seemed completely certain of himself, but now his words sounded rushed and defensive. If you believed I died in that accident, she said slowly, then why did my name appear in foster care records for years afterward? Victor Hale's eyes shifted toward her again, and this time the panic was more visible. I was not personally responsible for every administrative detail, he replied quickly. The foster system operates independently from private estate management. Alexander Voss' voice became colder as he spoke again. That explanation would be more convincing if your signature did not appear on every guardianship authorization for the last 17 years, he said. Victor Hale's face turned pale. For several seconds, he said nothing. Lily felt the truth pressing closer with every passing moment. You controlled where I lived, she said quietly. Victor Hale opened his mouth, but no answer came immediately. The silence itself said more than any words. Alexander Voss continued speaking with the same quiet authority that had ruled courts and empires for centuries. The trust fund established in Lily Harper's name contained $2 million, he said. That account was legally protected until she reached adulthood. Yet 10 years ago, the funds were transferred through a series of private legal channels authorized by your office. Victor Hale shook his head weakly. Those transfers were part of an estate restructuring, he said. They were necessary to protect the family holdings after the accident. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting, he replied. Because every record shows the money leaving the trust and entering accounts controlled by companies registered under your personal authority. Lily felt her hands tighten into fists at her sides. You stole it, she said quietly. Victor Hale immediately raised his hands in protest. That is not what happened, he insisted. The estate required careful management, and those funds were used to maintain investment structures that benefited the Voss holdings. Alexander's voice lowered even further. If that were true, then you would have no reason to erase Lily's existence from the estate records, he said. Victor Hale's breathing became uneven. His carefully maintained confidence was collapsing in front of them. Lily took another small step forward. For 17 years, she had lived with uncertainty about her future, but now she could see clearly that someone had made deliberate choices that affected every year of her life. Why did you say I was dead, she asked. Victor Hale's eyes moved toward the ground as if the answer could not survive the light above them. Because if the heir disappeared, the estate would eventually transfer to the managing authority, he admitted quietly. Alexander Voss' expression hardened with unmistakable anger beneath his calm voice. In other words, you expected Lily to vanish long before she reached adulthood, he said. Victor Hale said nothing. The silence was now complete confirmation. Lily felt a strange mixture of anger and disbelief as the truth finally revealed itself. All those years, she had believed her difficult life was simply the result of bad luck. Now she understood that someone had quietly taken everything meant to protect her future. Alexander Voss looked directly at the man who had betrayed his family trust. "Your deception ends tonight," he said quietly. The night air outside the office building felt colder now as the truth settled between the three of them. Victor Hale stood motionless under the streetlight with his shoulders slightly lowered as if the weight of his own actions had finally caught up to him. For years he had operated behind polished office doors and carefully written legal documents where consequences felt distant and controllable. Standing here face to face with the person whose life he had altered made that illusion impossible to maintain. Lily Harper remained only a few feet away from him, and the quiet determination in her eyes made the silence even heavier. For 17 years, she had moved through foster homes and temporary shelters, believing she simply had no family left in the world. Now the man responsible for that lie stood directly in front of her. Alexander Voss broke the silence first. His voice remained calm, but carried the quiet authority that had ruled powerful courts for centuries. "The financial records are already secured," he said. "My investigators began recovering the transaction history the moment the missing trust fund was discovered." Victor Hale lifted his head slowly. His voice sounded weaker now than it had only minutes earlier. "You cannot prove criminal intent," he said carefully. "The estate documents were written in a way that allowed discretionary management during periods of uncertainty." Alexander's eyes remained steady. "Discretionary management does not include declaring a living heir deceased," he replied. "Nor does it include transferring protected trust assets into personal investment structures under your control." Victor Hale opened his mouth, but no answer came. The street around them had grown quiet as the last few late-night cars passed in. The distance. Lily felt a strange calm beginning to replace the anger she had felt earlier. For the first time, she realized that the truth had already spoken for itself. This man had spent years believing he could control the outcome of her life. But now the reality stood clearly in front of him. "Why did you think I would disappear?" she asked softly. Victor Hale avoided her eyes at first, but eventually he answered. "Because the foster system rarely leaves permanent records once a child reaches adulthood," he admitted quietly. "Most young people simply move on with their lives, and no one looks closely at their history again." Lily felt a quiet sadness pass through her chest at those words. He had not seen her as a person with a future. He had simply assumed she would vanish into the background of the world. Alexander Voss stepped slightly closer, and the faint light reflected from the silver crest ring on his hand. "Your calculations failed because you underestimated the resilience of the person standing in front of you," he said. "Lily Harper survived every obstacle placed in her path, without the protection that should have been hers." Victor Hale lowered his gaze again. The confidence that once defined his career was now completely gone. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Alexander answered without hesitation. "The financial records will be submitted to federal investigators," he said. "The stolen funds will be traced through every account they passed through and recovered wherever possible." Victor Hale nodded slowly, as if he already understood the consequences waiting ahead. Lily remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "I spent years believing that my life just turned out this way," she said softly. "I thought maybe I simply was not meant to have anything more." Victor Hale did not respond. Alexander Voss looked at her with a calm expression that carried something gentler than the authority he had shown earlier. "That belief ends tonight," he said. Lily felt the truth of those words settle deeply in her thoughts. The past could not be changed, but the future no longer belonged to the man who tried to erase her existence. The city lights reflected softly across the wet pavement as the moment of confrontation slowly reached its end. Victor Hale stood quietly waiting for the consequences he could no longer avoid while Alexander Voss turned toward Lily with a calm but unmistakable sense of resolve about what would come next. The street outside the office building had grown quiet as the final moments of confrontation faded into the stillness of the late night. Victor Hale remained standing under the pale streetlight with his shoulders lowered while the reality of what he had done slowly settled over him. The confident attorney who once controlled powerful financial documents now looked like a man who had run out of explanations. Alexander Voss watched him for a moment longer before turning his attention back to Lily Harper. The city lights reflected softly across the wet pavement, while a gentle breeze moved through the empty street. For Lily, the world felt different than it had only a few hours earlier. The truth that had been hidden for 17 years was now completely exposed. She was no longer the forgotten girl moving quietly through the foster system. She was the rightful heir of a family whose influence reached far beyond the life she had known. Victor Hale finally spoke again, though his voice was quieter than before. "I understand what will happen next," he said. Alexander nodded once in acknowledgement. "Authorities will handle the legal consequences," he replied calmly. "The stolen funds will be recovered wherever possible, and every financial record connected to your actions will be reviewed." Victor Hale gave a slow nod, as if accepting the outcome he could no longer escape. Lily watched the exchange silently. For years she had imagined that justice might someday appear in her life, but she never expected to see it happen so clearly in front of her. Alexander then turned fully toward her, and the firmness in his voice softened slightly. "There is one more thing we must address tonight," he said. Lily looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" she asked. Alexander reached into his coat and removed a small document envelope that had remained there since he left his estate earlier that evening. He handed it gently to her. "Inside this envelope are the official papers restoring the Voss trust in your name," he explained. "The original account was compromised, but the full amount has already been transferred into a protected structure that no one can alter without your direct approval." Lily opened the envelope slowly and looked at the documents inside. The numbers written on the pages still felt almost impossible to understand, but she knew what they represented. A future that had once been stolen from her was now being returned. "You already fixed it," she said quietly. Alexander gave a calm nod. "The responsibility of protecting this family belongs to me," he replied. "That responsibility includes making sure that you never face the hardships you endured alone again." Lily felt a quiet warmth replace the uncertainty she had carried for so long. For the first time, she realized that her future no longer depended on surviving day by day. She now had the chance to choose what kind of life she wanted to build. "What happens now?" she asked gently. Alexander looked toward the horizon, where the first faint hint of dawn began to appear behind the buildings. "Now we begin a new chapter," he answered. "You will have the opportunity to study travel and learn everything about the history of the family you belong to. But more importantly, you will finally have the freedom to decide your own path." Lily smiled softly as she folded the documents back into the envelope. For years, she had been defined by circumstances she could not control. Tonight, that story had finally changed. Alexander Voss placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they prepared to leave the quiet street behind them. The girl who once slept in a shelter chair was no longer invisible to the world. She had reclaimed her name, her future, and the family that had finally found her again.